just one more thing. Unfortunately, I say that way probably too much, more than I should. But there is just one more thing I wanted to say about what we looked at last time in 1 Timothy chapter 4, where Paul writes to Timothy, I'll just start in verse 6. If you point these things out to the brothers and sisters, you'll be a good minister of Christ Jesus, nourished on the truths of the faith and of the good teaching that you have followed. Now, here's the one more thing. Paul didn't say of the good teaching you have received. When I first read it, I kind of read that into it. But that's not what Paul said. The good teaching you have followed. Now, here's my point. Church buildings on Sunday mornings are full of people who have received good teaching, but aren't doing very much to follow good teaching. I know that's a condescending thing to say, and I'm not really going to apologize because I think it's the truth. I think one of the reasons that the American church today, and we're not the only place where this is true, but it is true of the American church, and that's the church you and I are part of, is that we receive way more good teaching than we ever follow. Okay. Application is a point. Golly, this was a long time ago, 30 years ago probably. I wrote up a thing that I thought was pretty good, and I shared it with our adult teachers in the church way back when I was in Tulsa at Highland Park. And the title basically explained the premise of the whole idea. Application is the destination for the information train. I'll say it again because it's kind of a tongue twister. Application is the destination for the information train. Many, many Christians think the point is get more information, get more knowledge, be more literate. That's not the point. Now, you can't get to the point without more information, without more data, without more knowledge. The point is application is the destination for the information train. If you don't go to application, if we don't follow the teachings, the good teachings, it's like having a train that it's got the engine and the car is information, but it has there's no depot. It just goes up back and forth on the track and back and forth on the track and back. I've been on a few trains, and I've never been on a train that didn't have a destination. Every train has a destination, and the destination for the information train is application. It's following the good teachings. So, all right, going to jump to an application in the first 5 minutes here. Here's the thing about application. One of the things about application is you can't apply everything you know at the same time. Not possible. Here is my challenge. Contemplate the teachings, not just from me, but from your pastor, your preacher, your minister, your teacher, your small group. Open the horizon here. Pick one of the truths that you have learned or are learning, but you haven't really yet applied. And honestly, my first advice is pick the low-hanging fruit first. Meaning, do something that is not going to, you're not going to tear a muscle trying to do on the application thing. But find something and do, if it's only one thing, do the one thing, because one thing very often will lead to another thing, and then another thing, and then another thing. Benjamin Franklin, although he's not a Christian, I wouldn't. There are parts of his life story that I wouldn't even say he's just a highly moral guy, but he was a man of principle, okay, and in so many ways a good man, and certainly an intelligent and wise person. When he was younger, he had 12 virtues that he desired to be expressed in his life. And he focused one virtue per month. He focused his intention. He focused his effort. Oh, I want to suggest, and oh, by the way, 1 month was not enough, but it did get him started, he said. And so one thing will lead to another, and then another, and then another. What is your one thing? You can't do 6 things at one time. Don't kid yourself. Nobody can multitask in that way. And the research these days is that nobody multitasks. We just quickly switch tasks. It's called tasking switch. There's no multitasking. Your brain's not capable. This is a valuable piece of information when it comes to application. Pick one thing. So what's your one thing? Okay. Then in verse 7, we kind of started poking at this. Have nothing to do with godless myths and old wives' tales. The myth aspect, I mentioned to you that C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien had a very interesting and I think valid perspective on myth. This weekend, my wife and I joined good friends, and we went to see a movie. The title is The Most Reluctant Convert. And it was essentially, by the way, man, it was a great movie. It was well done, well produced, very well acted. Plus, you already know this if you've been watching this thing for very long. C.S. Lewis is my hero. And I told my brother before we went to the theater with the movie, I said, even if it's poorly done, I'm still going to be interested in a movie about my hero. Turns out it was very well done. It's kind of a reenactment of Lewis's autobiography, Surprised by Joy. And I found it just captivating. I recommend it to you. Well, okay. In that movie, there was a scene where Tolkien and Lewis were walking, which Lewis did often. He loved walking. Anyway, they were walking down a path, and we're talking about myth. And by the way, Lewis was very well informed on mythology, Norse mythology, Greek mythology, Roman mythology. And by the way, he could read these in the native tongue in which they originated. And man, his intellect and his ability blows me away, blows my mind. But here's the thing. Tolkien, this was before Lewis became the most reluctant convert. But in their conversation, Tolkien said, there are all of these myths. And he said, of course. But he said, here's the difference between all the other myths and the myth of Christianity. All the other myths, and there are many myths of a God dying and coming back to life, all the other myths are just fiction. But this myth actually happened. At first, I still pushed that idea when I first read many years ago, Surprised by Joy. I kind of pushed back on that, but now I'm realizing as a literary idiom, myth could be true. It doesn't have to be, but it could be. Well, anyway, we have to be careful and thoughtful about what myths we engage with. And Paul writes, have nothing to do with godless myths. It's not like, just don't take them too seriously. No. Have nothing to do with godless myths. I talked about it last time. What makes anything, and in this case, a myth, godless? It's the absence of God. Okay. And old wives' tales. Now, that seems condescending to us, right? Wives' tales? What a sexist term. Well, it is, probably. But in Paul's day, that wasn't sexism. That was vernacular. You know what a wives' tale is? It's, I'm trying to think of a wives' tale that we still observe, but wives' tales are just a step back from superstition and are more like almost useful. But here's the problem with old wives' tales. A couple of things. Number one, most old wives' tales have nothing to do with God and His work in your life and in the world. And the second thing is, many old wives' tales were nothing more than gossip and wags. Paul said, put those in the same category as godless myths. Well, I could go a long time on this. I don't think I need to. Have nothing to do with. Don't dabble in it. Don't mess around with it. Just have nothing to do with it. Rather, he says, train yourself to be godly. All right, so we've got godless myths, and then Paul writes, train yourself to be godly. Have nothing to do with godless myths. Instead, rather, train yourself in godliness, to be godly. Now let's talk about training. This is was for me a very powerful thing, the application. How does a marathon, well, we're getting ready for the Winter Olympics. How does any Winter Olympian get to the point where they could be a medal winner? Well, they just think, I think I'd like to do that where you ski and then you shoot and then you ski and then you shoot. I think I'd like to do that. So they enter the Olympics and win. You know better. So what do they do in order to even enter the Olympics and then to win? They train. Training is a process. It's not an event. If you've ever read anything written about or by a very, very top-tier athlete, you realize their whole life was organized around their training time. Training is not something they add in. No, training is the number one thing for them, and they organize their life around the training. They get up at 4 a.m. to go train, and they'll train for 4 or 5, sometimes 6 hours. And then the rest of the day, their diet, Their activities, on and on it goes, are organized around their training. We're going to talk next time about what that might look like for us if we really want to train ourselves to become godly. I'll see you then on Soul Care with Stevie Boy.